there is all but certainty that the Fed will cut rates tomorrow for the third time in just the last 12 months. Ask yourself, why is that necessary if we're in a so-called booming economy? How many times have you heard that? By the way, the Fed cut is not the only sign of big trouble ahead. Right now, the Fed is also literally bankrolling banks, giving them tons of money, ability to lend money to each other. That's why they're giving them the money, so that they can have enough money to be able to lend to each other. It's called the repo market. And what they're doing is somewhat still unprecedented. And joining us now is Christy Ai. She's the co-host of Boom Bust, and she really has a handle for this stuff because she's worked in the business, right? She's actually worked on Wall Street, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, third straight rate cut. What's going on?
Exactly. So while Trump is saying that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the market, let's take a real look at what's happened here. We've actually stopped raising rates. We previously had 2 rate cuts. This will be the third time expected tomorrow that we're going to have our third cut. We fully baked in a massive round of QE of $60 billion a month. We also have $130 billion of revolving overnight repo facility right now, injecting more and more liquidity into the market. $130 billion injected into the market every single night, trying to re-liquefy the entire financial system. What gives? If everything was so perfect, why are we injecting so much money every single day? And another point was made that we literally just printed more money, into thin air than the entire market cap of Bitcoin.
The feeling I get, and the feeling anyone who, as my mother always says, can see a thumb in front of their face, is that this is really good for Wall Street, not so good for Main Street.
Exactly. Lowering rates does make it a lot easier for corporates and companies to borrow. And that's exactly what they've been doing. They've been borrowing up to their necks. Right now, we have record high corporate debt leveling of $16 trillion. But on the other hand, as you said, it's not so good for Main Street because in Wall Street earnings that we just saw, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, JP Morgan, they all reported they did not make their money off of the investment banking side. They made their money off of the private wealth management side and the household side via credit card borrowing rates, auto lending rates, mortgage lending rates. They made their money off of the consumer of the average household from charging rates.
Let me just put it really bluntly. I'm going to ask you a really blunt question because you probably could answer or probably have a blunt answer, right? Are we essentially being lied to? Because on the one hand, we're being told that we're undergoing a booming economy. Never before have we lived in such prosperous times. On the other hand, we're literally cutting down the rates, which is only something, and introducing another level of QE, right, quantitative easing,
Absolutely.
which is usually only something you do when the economy sucks.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And the same thing happened last time when we addressed the repo. We were lied to because they said this was a short-term glitch. It's a technical problem in the market, and they blamed it. The original excuse was corporate tax payments. That was, quote, the original excuse that they used. Well, it's been several months now. The situation hasn't gotten any better. And in fact, last Thursday, they actually increased the amount of repo allotments every night. They increased it by 60% from only $75 billion a night to $120 billion a night to now $130 billion a night.
So I guess we should probably conclude the conversation with where this is heading.
Exactly.
I mean, you worry, right? I mean, you're an expert. You've worked in Wall Street. You know how this game is played. There has to be some concern that we're heading into something that we're not going to be able to control if we're trying to control it even before the problem actually exists already, right?
Exactly. There are massive bubbles that are building. We're at all-time highs in the market, right? So that's a huge bubble. There's a household debt, as we just explained, is a massive bubble. Corporate debt, $16 trillion bubble. National debt is a $23 trillion bubble. And right now, as Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Capital, the largest hedge fund in the world, he just said that the Fed currently has ineffective monetary policy. Whatever they're doing, it's not enough and it won't be enough.
But the Fed shouldn't really be manipulating the economy in this way, should they? I mean, are you comfortable with the Fed essentially doing everything that it's doing right now?
I don't believe that they should be interjecting themselves. I believe that the market should have to take its course, and the more that they try to interfere with it, the worse the landing's going to be.
Bingo. The worse the landing's going to be. Well said. I like the verbiage on that. Or as an old professor in college of mine used to say, good word choice, Miss Ai. Thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you.
Here's another story that we think is fascinating that you're going to want to know about. After 2 weeks of protest, the Prime Minister of Lebanon is resigning. Saad Hariri's resignation was preceded by protest over an economy, by the way, that's making average citizens really angry over debt, rising prices, and corruption. Sound familiar? Then there's Iraq. Yes, that Iraq. The one that we, the United States of America, promised to turn into the beacon of democracy and prosperity in the Middle East. How'd that work out? Most of the media don't tell you so much about Iraq these days. 15 years after the invasion, we're taking a closer look right here. Here now for us is NRS's special correspondent, Michele Greenstein. Okay, what are we learning?
Well, on Tuesday, Iraq actually witnessed one of the single deadliest attacks since these anti-government demonstrations began early this month on protesters. Masked men actually opened fire on protesters in the city of Karbala, and security officials say that 18 were killed and hundreds others were wounded. Now, protesters don't actually know whether these masked men were part of the riot police, were part of special forces, or even not members of the government. As of right now, we don't know. Now, also on Tuesday, after the imposed overnight curfew, tens of thousands of people marched on Baghdad's Tahrir Square, again calling for economic reform as they have been all month, and also for the upheaval of the country's political elite. Now, so far, protesters have had demonstrations in Baghdad, Karbala, Nahaf, Bara, and Kirkuk. In fact, yes, all over the country. This is very widespread. And this past Sunday, actually, police from the country's counterterrorism service were actually deployed in Baghdad. Now, in total, over 200 people have been killed since this unrest began, and over 2,000, Rick, have been injured.
Wow, something we don't hear anything about. What are they protesting?
So a number of things, mainly rampant corruption in the government. There's spiraling unemployment, a very low amount of jobs, especially for the youth. Poverty, again, especially among the youth, and the poor provision of basic services that are needed to live. In terms of a government response, earlier this month we saw the U.S. installed Prime Minister issue a decree including a dozen intended reforms, but the opposition, including spiritual leaders like the Grand Ayatollah, says that the government has not fulfilled the demands of the people to fight corruption and provide these vital public services. They are not satisfied, to say the least, with the government's response.
You wonder, since the United States has such a huge military presence there, and they still, to some extent, do?
Sure.
Are they not protesting the U.S. troops?
So the U.S. troop presence is not on the high list of the demands, but what we're seeing right now in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and Iraq is less of a military presence, at least compared to, let's say 2009, when President Obama had over 180,000 boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's less of a troop presence and more of a political presence. In fact, one of the main critiques of the current government in Iraq is that the government is a U.S. puppet government. In fact, they want this government gone so badly that in an interview with Axios last week, the president of Iraq was actually unable to answer whether the current prime minister would be in office in a week. Now, also to your point about the troops, earlier this week, we actually started seeing reports that the Iraqi parliament is preparing to oust U.S. troops entirely. We saw that these numbers are going down, but now that they're considering getting rid of U.S. troops entirely. And this is, of course, framed in the U.S. press as a move that would be good for Iran. But what it really shows is that the zeitgeist in Iraq is really moving further from wanting a U.S. presence in the country.
Well said. Really good report. Good detail. Rich, full-throated. Well done. Thank you, Michele. Appreciate it. That's our news. We'll be back in a half hour with a lot more. Thanks so much for being with us, at which time, as we always like to say, it'll be time to do news again. I'll see you then.